Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and it's good to speak on this very important area of copyright law and copyright reform. And I think it is important at the outset, Deputy Speaker, to reflect on why this legislation is necessary. And the reason that it's necessary, Deputy Speaker, is because of changes in technology. Now, the growth of the internet, of course, Deputy Speaker, has been massively beneficial to society in so many ways: education, in healthcare, in entertainment news, you name it, Deputy Speaker. But as in all things, there has been a downside, and one of the difficulties that has arisen in the internet age is that it's made it really relatively simple to commit acts of piracy, Deputy Speaker, and there was probably always a human capacity to engage in piracy. It's just that online technology makes it so much easier. And as a consequence of that, Deputy Speaker, the amount of piracy has, of course, grown quite substantially to the point where it is a very serious threat to legitimate businesses. The other issue, of course, with the internet and distribution online, Deputy Speaker, is not only is it relatively simple for consumers to engage in acts of piracy, it's also relatively difficult to track down the source of those acts of piracy in a geographical sense. It's not like the old days, Deputy Speaker, where a pirate would be perhaps clutching a pirated VHS tape at the local store. This is about content coming from all around the world and from many different locations, and as a consequence, it has been a very difficult problem for government to address and to seek to minimise the impact of piracy. Now, there are two categories of business, Deputy Speaker, that are negatively affected by piracy, and both of those categories of business deserve the right to be protected against unlawful piracy. The first is producers, Deputy Speaker. We hear a lot about the Australian production industry. We have a proud tradition in this nation of punching above our weight in video production, in film and television and so on. And the capacity for people to make use of that programming without paying for it obviously has a negative impact, a significant negative impact on those local producers, and protecting their rights is important. There's also another category, Deputy Speaker, of businesses that don't actually produce the content but buy the right to distribute it, and their rights are equally important. And that content isn't always, of course, produced in Australia, Deputy Speaker, but rights to distribute it are obtained in Australia, and it's very important that government acts sensibly to minimise piracy wherever it can. And it's worth thinking, Deputy Speaker, about why this space has changed so dramatically. And I think if you think through the different modes of video distribution and how they have changed in recent years, it provides a pretty clear insight into why reform in this area has been needed. And focusing on video distribution, Deputy Speaker, of course there's a wide range of traditional formats and some new ones. Perhaps the oldest of all is theatrical release, Deputy Speaker. And in the old world, the first distribution of a film would be in the theatre. There was no capacity, in a practical sense, for that film to be accessed and distributed prior to the theatrical release, and consequently there wasn't a major problem. Now, of course, you have a situation where people can attend theatrical releases in other countries. They can make a copy of that movie and then they can distribute it online same day. And that might be months ahead of when that theatrical release is due to be distributed in Australia. Same applies, of course, in free-to-air television. I'm sure you'll fondly remember, Deputy Speaker, the days of when the television programs would be seen in Australia we'd all wait for the Australian release of the program, often some months after it was broadcast in the US or other countries, and there was no suggestion that anyone would be able to access that program beforehand. Now you can. Now you can, because as soon as it's released in other countries, particularly the United States, those online copies are often available. The same applies videos and DVDs, Deputy Speaker, and of course DVDs were copied and continue to be copied, and there continues to be copyright infringement in physical formats. But again, the complexity of actually going and getting a copied DVD, of selling it, of distributing it, is of a much higher order than it is of simply putting something online, and as a consequence, online distribution is so much greater. And we now have an emerging set of industries, Deputy Speaker, of legitimate online distribution of video. And what we've seen there is, over the past 7 or 8 years, as internet speeds have been sufficient to distribute video online, the industry has been principally based around what's called ad-supported distribution, Deputy Speaker, and often known as catch-up TV, where a program after distribution on broadcast is shown online and advertising is sold against that. Now, again, the problem for content owners is, once those programs are broadcast on free-to-air television, there are often free copies being distributed online without ads in them. That's a very compelling proposition for consumers. Watch something without ads or watch something with ads, and unfortunately many consumers are choosing to watch those pirated copies. And the same applies to transaction video on demand and increasingly subscription video on demand, where we are seeing the rise of services like Stan and Netflix and others. Now, what copyright owners deserve is for fair rules of play to be imposed across the system, so that people's intellectual property is protected. And I'll come to in a moment to the specific provisions of this bill, which will go a long way to solving this significant problem. But I also want to touch on another issue in the area of online copyright, Deputy Speaker, and it concerns the use of the facilitation of copyright infringement through the distribution of internet protocol boxes, or IP boxes as they're known. And this is an important issue, Deputy Speaker, for a number of pay TV broadcasters, some of which are very important in my community, in the Chinese language community, in the Arabic-speaking community, and in a range of other communities as well, Deputy Speaker. And we face a situation today where, at some retail stores in Sydney, it's possible to buy an IP box which is effectively sold on the promise that it will enable you to access a range of copyright infringing material. So you buy the box, and the box is configured in such a way that it accesses content which is legitimately pay TV content, but which is being sourced unlawfully from another jurisdiction and provided at no cost to the consumer. And those retailers and distributors are effectively facilitating the breach of copyright. Now, the provisions in the bill we discussed today go right back to the source of the infringing material, right back to those unlawful channels and unlawful sites and so on. But it is important to reflect also on entities that are contributing to online infringement through the sale of IP boxes which are specifically designed to encourage copyright infringement. Now, this is a very important issue, Deputy Speaker, and companies like TVB, World Media and others face this issue every day, and it is a very important one. Now, Deputy Speaker, this legislation is going to help enormously to reduce the incidence of copyright infringement. It takes a very practical approach. It's a complex area, Deputy Speaker. There are people all around the world involved in copyright infringement, and it is incumbent upon legislators to be practical and think about how legislation such as this will work in the real world. And this will be effective because what this enables, Deputy Speaker, is for an entity who feels that its copyright has been breached to seek an order requiring an ISP to effectively block access to that infringing material. Now, Deputy Speaker, most of the time that infringing material will be sourced overseas. There is, of course, a regime already in place for Australian sourced material, but most of the time that infringing material will be sourced from overseas. Now, in a practical sense, it is very difficult for the Australian law to go after a copyright infringing service that might be based in Kazakhstan or in any part of the world for that matter. But what we can do is require ISPs who are based in Australia and subject to our laws to act to minimise the likelihood of copyright infringing activities occurring. And that basically requires the ISPs, Deputy Speaker, to block access to sites or other online locations that are engaging in infringing activity. Now, the ISPs themselves have done nothing wrong, Deputy Speaker, and importantly, this legislation makes that clear. There's no suggestion that the ISPs themselves are engaged in copyright infringing material. But by going to the source and blocking the relevant service, that will go a long way to reducing the incidence of copyright infringement. So it's a very practical solution. It's also important, Deputy Speaker, that the legislation provides that in order for an order to be issued by the court requiring an ISP to take down that material, that the primary purpose of the online location must be copyright infringement. So what that means, Deputy Speaker, is if the site is engaged in legitimate activity, such as, for instance, say a Netflix based in the US, the fact that an individual in Australia might be accessing that site in a manner which infringes copyright does not mean in and of itself that Netflix, in that example, is engaged in activity which should be blocked. And that's a really important distinction. So this basically goes after entities whose business model is to infringe copyright. And it's extremely important that this occurs, Deputy Speaker, because just as in any other industry, people have a right to be protected against theft of their physical or intellectual property, so should people involved in our creative industries who employ so many Australians and do so much good work. Now, the good news is that the injunction powers that are proposed by this law have been effective in the UK, in Ireland, in Singapore, and in other jurisdictions. And again, the capacity for the copyright owner to simply seek for the offending site to be blocked by the ISP is the most practical possible way of addressing this problem. And I concur with others in this debate in saying that I think the way that this will play out is that in the early days you will probably see a number of court actions initiated. You'll see some court orders issued for takedown notices for infringing material. But then what will happen logically over time, Deputy Speaker, is that ISPs and content providers will work together in a sensible way and no doubt will circumvent much of that court formality and work together in a constructive fashion to take down offending material. And that's as it should be. So these are very sensible steps, Deputy Speaker. They are practical. They're not going to catch lawful activities. Importantly, they make it clear that ISPs themselves are not engaged in unlawful activity, but they make use of the technical capacity of ISPs to go directly to the source of the problem and seek to solve it. Now, this is a complex area, Deputy Speaker. This is an area of law that will continue to evolve, but these are important provisions and I strongly commend them to the House.